Welcome back to The Real News and the final segment of this series of interviews with Daniel Levy. He's the head of the Middle East Task Force for the New America Foundation. Thank you. So you just got back from Israel. Talk about the mood there. And one of the things I think that was quite striking is how public the conversation seems to have gotten about making Palestinian Israelis swear allegiance to the Jewish state, or they're going to lose their right to vote, disenfranchisement or a banning of Palestinian Arab parties. The dialogue there seems to be getting far to the right. And is there much difference between the different parties? Because we seem to be hearing parts of this argument from almost all the leaders.
I mean, the most stunning, striking phenomenon in this election was the party of Mr. Avigdor Lieberman, the Israel Beitenu, Israel, our homeland party, went from 11 to 15 seats. But it was the campaign that they ran that became... You know, there's always one slogan that is remembered from election campaigns. And I think from this election campaign in Israel, it was the no loyalty, no citizenship. And the theme, the key theme around which the Lieberman campaign focused was, he said, Israeli Arab citizens were suspicious. You've got a question mark indelibly marked on your forehead. You swear an oath of loyalty to the Jewish state, or we rescind your citizenship. I don't think this will pass as legislation. There's been attempts to pass it before as legislation, but it became a centerpiece of the discourse. And rather than what we've seen in Europe, where you've had, Mr. Lieberman is no more extreme than your classical anti-immigrant, populist, xenophobic, militant ethnic nationalist. He doesn't have to be. Those kind of people are quite extreme enough. What you saw in Europe, though, when you had the Front National in France, when you had the Flams Bloc in Belgium, when you had the Swiss party of Mr. Bloch, etc., is that mainstream political parties came together and they tended, most of the time, whether in national or municipal elections, to say, we don't cross this line. There's a cordon sanitaire. We don't work with you. The thing that was worrying and ugly in this election in Israel was the opposite happened. Netanyahu, Livni, the different parties are today falling over themselves. Who can ingratiate themselves more with Mr. Lieberman? Now, does it say something rotten about Israel's political and electoral system? Perhaps. But does it really ask a question about Israel's value system? This is the danger. Israel has defined itself as a Jewish and democratic state. To the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel, it's heavy on the former, on the Jewish, and it's rather light on the democratic. When the peace camp, when Labour, etc., was pushing for a peace process, when Kadima was pushing for a peace process, and they came to the Israeli public, their message was, you have to support deoccupation and Palestinian statehood, even though it never happened, but when they tried to get support for the idea, because this is the way to keep Israel demographically Jewish. Now, maybe that was the only way to convince the Jewish public, but it means that there is an entrenched narrative in Israel today. And the challenge for Israel, if it wants to maintain this sense of being a democracy, is really, how do you make a more inclusive Israel? I grew up in an England where the flag was the cross, where we sang God Save the Queen in our anthem, where my school holidays were Christian holidays, where there's a direct link between the Church of England and the state. And I'm saying all those things could happen in Israel in a non-offensive way. But only if Israel creates a more inclusive definition.
But it seems to be heading in the other direction. And is the grand plan here some kind of weak Bantustan Palestinian state and some form of expulsion of Palestinian Israelis into this state? And is that the grand plan for keeping the state Jewish?
You know, I find it difficult to talk in terms of grand plans because you have in Israel a number of political streams. It is a democracy. There was an attempt to ban some of the Arab political parties from running. That attempt was nipped in the bud by the Supreme Court. So they are represented in the Knesset. So I don't think there's a grand plan. Yes, there are actors in the Israeli political establishment for whom the idea of and I've been told this by an MK, by a member of the parliament, a smaller but cleaner, ethnically cleaner Israel is the plan. Do land swaps, where more of the Arab Palestinian Israelis are part of the Palestinian state, or move them into the Palestinian state. Israel has to come to terms with, I would argue that Israel has to come to terms with what it means to have a large, non-Jewish minority in a democratic state. But yes, there is a discourse in Israel, and I think we're approaching a moment of truth here. We're approaching a moment of truth of whether Israel can prove itself, that it can live up to democratic ideals. And I think the Lieberman phenomenon is a horrible phenomenon, but it's now floated to the surface. And it may be that that's the direction that Israeli politics goes in. It becomes more of an ethnocracy rather than a democracy. It may just be that by raising these issues front and center, there is finally a pushback. There is finally, in France,
And what will be the U.S. position towards this kind of drift if there is a move in this kind of ethnic cleansing direction?
Well, I think the entire international community will when you have a Lieberman in the government, when you have Kahanism, the Kahanist movement, essentially inside so entrenched now in the Israeli
movement that was more or less illegalized for a while.
It was illegal, and it's a terrorist group registered as such in America. That hasn't happened to Lieberman's party. I think the international community will have to say, what kind of a standard are we going to apply here? It will be very difficult. It will be very difficult for Jewish communities around the world, how they relate to this phenomenon. Is it going to be a wake-up call? Or is it going to get worse? I think the American response will be to work with whatever government is elected in Israel. That should have been their response on the Palestinian side, of course. That wasn't. But I think that will be the response on the Israeli side. However, as policies are developed, and if Lieberman, and it's not clear that he will, but if he does have more and more influence, those who today say this is resembling a bit too much an apartheid system will gain more and more traction for that argument. And many people will say, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, and this is the challenge that Israel faces.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the Real News Network.
Donate today and receive a new documentary film available to members of the Real News Network. The History of the National Security State with legendary author Gore Vidal. Bonus features of the DVD include an in-depth response to Vidal from ex-CIA analyst Ray McGovern, who served under 7 U.S. presidents, an exclusive interview with Colin Powell's former Chief of Staff Larry Wilkerson, and an insightful interview with oil policy analyst Antonia Juhas.
The news magazine of the screen. Living glimpses of history in the making.
Hollywood and Washington, there's a symbiotic relationship. They both deal with illusions. Reality doesn't often play much of a part. I think I saw through the myth of the Cold War almost from the beginning. I was a Washington political kid from a political family. Roosevelt first had radio because he had this great speaking voice and everyone liked to hear. Truman proceeded to break every arrangement that Roosevelt had set up for a peaceful coexistence. And Truman thought that it would be a good idea. Why not just stay armed all the time? And then he devised the national security state. You've got to go up and swear allegiance to the United States or else you're a commie. I mean, we had imported fascism. We get Dwight Eisenhower, who said that we have this great military industrial complex. It is a dangerous thing. And he said this is going to change everything. And the way our country's governed, it's going to change us politically. Along comes Jack Kennedy, who wanted to make his mark, believed in the Cold War. But he said in this kind of politics, it is the appearance of things that matters. I think everybody should take a sober look at the world about us. The national security state still exists, only it isn't communism anymore, it's terrorism. This is the most serious thing that has happened in the history of the United States. Knowledge is power. We need an honest news system.
We need the real news.
This is the sort of thing we can build right now without anyone else's permission from the government or from the business community. It's the power's in our hands.
If we're not going to sleepwalk into more wars, we think we need to start with a television news network that won't bow to pressure and has the courage to seek facts. And that means independent economics. And that's why we need you.
Make a tax-deductible donation now of at least $10 a month or a one-time give of at least $75. As a thank you for your support, we will send you the new documentary film, The History of the National Security State.